In the quiet, tree-lined suburbs north of Philadelphia stands a titan of the Gilded Age, a crumbling monument to impossible wealth and the crushing weight of tragedy, Lynnewood Hall. Spanning 110 rooms and covering 38 acres, this neoclassical behemoth was once the jewel of American domestic architecture, built not merely as a home, but as a sanctuary for art, a stage for dynasty, and a fortress against the anxieties of the modern world. Commissioned at the turn of the 20th century by Peter A.B. Widener, a man whose colossal fortune stemmed from streetcar railways and banking, Lynnewood Hall was conceived as a symbol of permanent, unassailable success. Yet today, the mansion is shrouded in peeling paint, broken glass, and the pervasive silence of abandonment, a stark visual metaphor for the catastrophic misfortunes that seem to cling to the Widener name, transforming an icon of prosperity into a rumored cursed estate whose very existence presaged financial ruin and devastating personal loss for its inhabitants. The origin of this grand, ill-fated house begins with Peter A.B. Widener himself, a man of humble beginnings who, through relentless industry, shrewd investment in meatpacking, and a masterful consolidation of Philadelphia's burgeoning street railway network, became one of the wealthiest men in America. His fortune was not inherited but forged, giving him an intense desire for validation that could only be satisfied by creating an environment of European-level grandeur. Widener hired Horace Trumbauer, a self-taught architectural prodigy, to design the estate. Trumbauer, just 27 years old, delivered a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts design, completed in 1900, which featured Indiana limestone, a cavernous art gallery, a ballroom for 1,000 guests, and a meticulously crafted setting for Widener's rapidly growing collection of old masters, which rivaled any European royal collection. The sheer scale and opulence of the construction were not just a display of wealth, but a deliberate act of historical placement, an attempt by an American industrialist to buy his way into the echelons of eternal aristocracy. The interiors of Lynnewood Hall were legendary, vast halls paneled in rare, imported French walnut, floors paved with priceless Italian marble, and ceilings adorned with gold leaf. This was not a house designed for comfort, but for display, a theatrical backdrop for masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Raphael. Widener's son, George Dunton Widener, and George's son, Harry Elkins Widener, were both deeply involved in the collection, traveling Europe to acquire pieces that would fill the 34-foot-high Central Art Gallery. It was this focus on enduring art and family legacy that gave the house its initial meaning, a belief that the vast walls of limestone would protect the family stature for generations. However, this magnificent structure, intended to solidify a dynasty, would instead serve as a stage for its rapid, heartbreaking disintegration. The first major tragedy struck a few years after the family settled into their palatial home. George and Harry Widener sailed to Europe and booked a return trip that, unbeknownst to them, would become synonymous with the 20th century's most profound disaster. The luxury liner RMS Titanic was meant to be a crowning achievement of modern engineering and opulence, mirroring the very qualities of Lynnewood Hall itself. But in April 1912, when the ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, the illusion of unassailable security shattered. George and Harry both perished in the frigid waters, leaving Peter A.B. Widener and his daughter-in-law, Eleanor, alone at Lynnewood Hall to mourn the devastating sudden loss of two direct heirs. The immense house, built to house a flourishing dynasty, was suddenly emptied, its grand halls filled with the silence of premature death, forever cementing the estate's early association with profound, almost biblical misfortune. The loss of his son and grandson cast a long, cold shadow over Peter A.B. Widener's remaining years, transforming Lynnewood Hall from a vibrant palace of ambition into a mausoleum of memory. Peter himself died in 1915, just 3 years after the Titanic disaster, leaving his immense fortune and the responsibility of the great estate to his surviving son, Joseph E. Widener. Joseph, inheriting his father's passion for art, became the new custodian of both the house and the collection. Under Joseph, the artistic splendor of Lynnewood Hall reached its zenith. He continued to acquire masterpieces, cementing the Widener collection status as one of the most important private collections in the world. He understood that the primary purpose of the hall was to display these treasures, allowing the house to function as a highly selective private museum where the elite of the international art world often gathered. However, the financial burden of maintaining such a massive estate in the face of changing economic times was staggering. Lynnewood Hall was conceived in an era of virtually unregulated wealth, but the dawn of the 20th century brought progressive income taxes and the eventual Wall Street crash. While Joseph Widener was adept at managing the family's vast capital, the costs associated with the daily operation of the house, heating its cavernous spaces, employing dozens of domestic staff, and ensuring the environmental stability for the irreplaceable artwork were astronomical. The very grandeur that defined the estate became its Achilles heel, turning it into a perpetual drain on the family's assets. The most significant turning point for the long-term fate of Lynnewood Hall came not from a sudden disaster, but from a calculated act of generosity. Joseph E. Widener, recognizing the difficulty of maintaining the collection within a private residence forever, and possibly influenced by the earlier tragedy, decided to donate the core of the Widener collection, including Rembrandt's, Vermeer's, and Italian Renaissance works, to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This monumental gift, finalized in 1942, was intended as an enduring public legacy, ensuring the art would be preserved and accessible, fulfilling the dynastic ambition in a new, civic way. While securing the family's cultural place in history, the act simultaneously stripped Lynnewood Hall of its raison d'etre. The house, which was meticulously designed around this collection, suddenly became an empty shell, a grand, decorative vessel with its soul removed. Joseph E. Widener died shortly after the donation, and the burden of the immense artless estate fell to the next generation. Unlike their predecessors, the younger Wideners had neither the inclination nor the inherited capital structure to sustain the mansion's immense operating expenses. The once clear purpose of the hall as an art sanctuary and dynastic showplace had vanished. What remained was simply a massive, costly structure, a relic of a bygone era whose sheer size and extravagance were utterly incompatible with mid-20th century American life. The curse was not supernatural, but logistical and financial. The hall itself became the instrument of the family's eventual withdrawal and ultimately the dispersal of the remaining estate. Following Joseph E. Widener's death, Lynnewood Hall began its long, agonizing decline, a process of slow, structural disintegration mirroring the family's withdrawal from public prominence. The hall was too vast, too costly, and too tied to a single, irreplaceable collection to ever function as a viable private residence again. In 1948, the estate was sold out of the Widener family. The buyer, a secretive residential developer, was primarily interested in the land, not the house itself. The developer quickly subdivided much of the surrounding parkland for profitable residential construction, a process that dramatically reduced the acreage and destroyed the intended pastoral setting of Trumbauer's original design. The sheer irony was inescapable. The ultimate symbol of permanent consolidated wealth was literally being chipped away and sold piece by piece to finance the very suburbanization it was built to transcend. The colossal structure, still filled with many of the remaining antique furnishings and architectural elements, was purchased in 1952 by the Faith Theological Seminary, an institution headed by fundamentalist preacher Carl McIntyre. The seminary acquired the property for a mere fraction of its original construction cost, a move which initially seemed to secure the house's survival by granting it an institutional tax-exempt purpose. For a period, the Grand Hall functioned as classrooms, offices, and dormitories. The sheer novelty of theological students studying in rooms paneled in imported French walnut and beneath soaring gold-leaf ceilings provided an almost surreal contrast. Yet the seminary, perpetually hampered by financial instability and legal battles, soon proved to be an utterly incapable custodian of the historic property. Under the seminary's ownership, the systemic neglect began. Maintenance on a 110-room mansion requires millions annually. The seminary could barely manage thousands. Without the necessary funds, the roof began to fail, leading to devastating water intrusion that warped wood paneling, cracked intricate plasterwork, and severely compromised the interior finishes. Furthermore, to raise much-needed capital, the seminary began to systematically sell off the remaining contents. Priceless architectural elements, including ornate chandeliers, antique doors, marble fireplaces, and extensive decorative ironwork, were stripped from the house and sold, often to international buyers. This final, painful dispersal represented the physical dismantling of Widener's original vision. Unlike the dignified donation of the art collection, these sales were driven by desperation, marking the true beginning of the estate's descent into ruin and feeding the perception that the house was somehow cursed or doomed to financial destruction. The controversies surrounding the seminary intensified in the 1990s and 2000s, escalating the building's decay. Legal battles with the local township over code violations, taxes, and general neglect became common. Eventually, the property fell into severe disrepair that the cost of necessary restoration reached tens of millions of dollars, a figure far exceeding the value of the structure in its dilapidated state. Lynnewood Hall transitioned from an abandoned home to an endangered landmark, its immense silent presence serving as a cautionary tale of how even the greatest wealth cannot guarantee the preservation of legacy against the relentless forces of time, economic change, and the tragic lack of a committed guardian. The decades of neglect under the seminary's ownership transformed Lynnewood Hall from a historic ruin into a ruin of national significance. Its fate became a microcosm of the challenges faced by preserving Americans' grand estates when their original purpose and financial underpinning vanished. The scale of the property, once its greatest boast, became its final, most formidable enemy. The 110 rooms, the expansive attic and basement networks, and the complex mechanical systems all succumbed to the slow, inexorable march of entropy. Photos and investigative reports from the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed a devastating interior landscape,
ornate plasterwork collapsing onto marble floors, priceless wall coverings peeling away from damp walls, and entire sections of the roof structure failing under the weight of decades of deferred maintenance. The perception of a curse intensified during this period, fueled not by supernatural events, but by the tangible evidence of financial ruin and decay that seemed impossible for a structure of its magnitude. The estate, having witnessed the tragic loss of 2 Widener heirs, now became a visual monument to the American fear of losing consolidated wealth. It stood as a harsh reminder that even fortunes built on industries as foundational as railways and banking could not purchase immunity from the economic forces that eventually dismantled the Gilded Age structure. The house itself became a symbol of hubris, a structure too big to save, too expensive to love, and too historically significant to simply demolish. The final chapter of the seminary's ownership was marked by desperate attempts to unload the property. Following years of financial instability, the seminary eventually abandoned its operations at Lynnewood Hall, leaving it vacant and highly vulnerable to vandalism and weather. The property changed hands several times in the 2000s and 2010s, with various private investors and organizations making promises of restoration that invariably fell apart, overwhelmed by the projected cost, a figure often exceeding $50 million for a full rehabilitation. Each failed attempt added another layer to the property's tragic narrative, reinforcing the public perception that the house was simply too demanding and